Uh, Good afternoon, everyone. On behalf of the Siburt Institute uh, Chaplains Fellowship, let me welcome you to our quarterly Lunch and Learn session. I'm Paul Riddle. I'm Director of Spiritual Care for Lifeline Chaplaincy in Houston, and I serve on the steering committee that oversees the Chaplains Fellowship. And it's my privilege to welcome you to our session today. Our resource person is Virgil Fry, and he has two colleagues with him. And I'm going to turn it over to you, Virgil, and let you tell us what you want us to know about you and Judy and Dave,
All
and the
right.
topic, of course.
Oh, yeah. I was just going to talk about me for about an hour. That's my favorite. So I'm with Lifeline Chaplaincy as on their board now. I'm no longer the executive director, and but I'm still involved. In fact, I'm calling from, or this is the offices in Houston right now. I'm also doing a part-time gig training spiritual care volunteers with the Institute for Spirituality and Health here that is placing volunteers that go into nursing homes, assisted living, personal care homes, some of those that are underserved in many ways. Many of them don't have chaplaincy or spiritual care. And particularly when COVID shut down everybody from going in, many of these places have found it hard to get footing to get people back in. So that's keeping me out of trouble most of the time, working with volunteers. It's been good. I'm a father of two, more importantly, grandfather of five, two here in Houston, 14 and a 17-year-old. And then I have three in San Antonio. My son and his wife are involved with the Sunset Ridge Church of Christ there. And there are three Fry kids down there, and 9, 7, and 5, I think. I haven't done the math lately. It's harder to do. So I'm going to talk a little bit with PowerPoint about spiritual resilience. What do we do when life kind of crashes in on us, and it does a lot, but also how do we walk with others? But more importantly, I want you to hear the two stories of our guest presenters that I will introduce in just a few minutes. But to introduce the topic, I'm going to share with you a video that was done through the MD Anderson Chaplains Department Cancer Center. And it's a chapter from my book called Lessons from a Horseback Ride. And it talks about when things happen to us that we didn't quite plan. So if I can get that to work, we'll start with that, and then I'll come back. So let's see, share the screen. Share the sound. Okay.
Mental cobwebs, heavy as lead torso. How in the world did I wind up in this ditch? Where's Mike? Where's the horse? Why is it so quiet out here? And why am I so sore? These were my first thoughts. Questions, actually. Questions that feebly tried to reorient the scrambled sixth grader's mind. Fortunately, within a few minutes, the puzzle pieces began to fit back together. It was a gorgeous West Texas afternoon. My younger brother and I, feeling the call of after-school freedom, bridled the two horses that were a part of our farm life. Riding bareback, saddles were too much trouble and less macho. We felt a rush of exhilaration as the horses galloped across the field. Reaching a dirt road, we slowed the horses down. They took the opportunity to come to a complete halt, eyeing some tall grass growing in the ditch. Cactus, the quarter horse I was riding, inched near a single wire strung along the property line. I fantasized briefly. What would it be like to touch an electric fence? But my thoughts soon returned to my horse, and I watched her long ears spring forward. I knew what the wire was for. I assumed that Cactus was equally savvy. Like a curious cat on the prowl, she gingerly stretched her long face close to the low humming fence. This intrigue was the last thing I remembered. My trusty steed had, in a split second, learned the exact science of how efficiently a wet nose conducts electricity. I had simultaneously mastered the physics of horse-powered bodily flight. Slowly, the jolt that blackened my consciousness wore off, and I began to reacquaint myself with reality. As I pushed myself upright with shaky arms, I spotted Cactus a half-mile down the road, and she was fine. My brother, I later found out, had hightailed it to the house to inform my family that I was dead. I wasn't dead, but I was rattled, not to mention agitated, plus a little wiser. It was not on my schedule for learning to take place that afternoon, but enlightenment happened. My agenda was simple: a leisurely ride to escape the confinement of a school day. Yet that day's unscheduled tutoring is still vividly sketched in my psyche and remains so decades later. Such unscheduled, usually uninvited lessons broaden our horizons. That day, I learned to expect the unexpected, to pick yourself up after being flattened, and to differentiate between assumptions and facts. Ever been jolted by a fence-sniffing horse? Ever had some event or news totally turn your world upside down? Ever find yourself amazed that you survived, not to mention grew, because of that day? Each of us owns a multidimensional storehouse garnered from the school of hard knocks. Things that disrupt, that are not in the curriculum, possess great power. Power to teach new perspectives, to break preconceived notions, to reduce false conceptions of self-sufficiency. They are the spiritual and psychological nudges that can awaken our sense of the transcendent. Life for humans is not merely physical survival. Life is a spiritual journey, one of well mapped out highways and plenty of unplanned detours. The integration of formal education and aha moments quickens us to hear God's calming voice, a voice that assures us that this world and our part in it is full of purpose and meaning. Lord, thanks for letting me learn, even when I think school's out for the day.
Hush. All right. Get back to it. So I'm sure most of you can identify with things that have broken through your day, and we had well laid out plans and some good ideas, and life tends to throw you some curveballs, sometimes minor ones. In the big scheme of things, my story was a minor one, except my brother thought I was dead, but I wasn't. But the big things also break through. I've been through a lot at this stage in my life. The loss of my wife, Carol, after being married 34 years. After that, her dad, my mother, and my sister died all within a year and a half of that. So my family is still being reformed, even though that's been 15 years. And then there's just things all the time that happen. Some of us were involved with the Christian Scholars Conference that was here in Houston that Lipscomb sponsored, and the theme was the transitions going on in the faith communities, the churches, and what are we doing with that, and how do we respond? It's very telling. Things are not like they were 10 years ago or 20 years ago, and so we're all having to learn new ways to be, and what is God calling us to? So we're talking a little bit. Let me share the screen again, and I will try it. Go, and I want to play the current slide. So looks nice and even there, doesn't it? Easy to go straight down the road. We humans often seek homeostasis. I learned that in biology class. Those comfortable routines that provide us with the security of consistency. You know, I was thinking about the routines I have just in getting dressed, like for today. I go and I do my shower, and then I have all my grooming products lined up in a certain place where I can always find them. Just go left to right and get to that little pill box that the doctor has with all these nice little pills to keep me going. Many of us will go to the same grocery store. Often we'll go up and down the same aisles just because of the familiarity. In our church life, you may have a particular area you sit in, and woe to somebody who might sit in your seat or pew. That's just disturbing to us. We drive the same ways. If you replace your car, you often replace it with the same brand that you just had. We kind of do that, I think, to try to get some handle on consistency. And sometimes it works, and many times it gets interrupted by life. Objects break, friends betray. That's a painful one. Family splinter. Sometimes this is extremely disturbing and grief causing. Loved ones die, dreams shatter, health degenerates, weather destroys. In Houston, we know about the hurricanes and other things like that. In West Texas, you know about tornadoes and drought. Wars rage, finances disappear, faith disappoints. Sometimes our faith does not provide us the answers or the comfort that we think we need at the moment, and that can be a faith crisis. And so we are constantly adjusting, coping, seeking stability. I tell a lot of people that are in the ministry world, including chaplains, if you're not flexible, you probably shouldn't go in ministry. But actually, any faith walk, anything we do, that's true. But chaplains, hospital chaplains, and those in the ministry world, your lives get interrupted all the time by things that break through, or the 3 o'clock in the morning phone calls. Can you come help me? My 1-year-old has been taken to ICU, or there's been a car wreck, or usually the 3 o'clock in the morning phone calls are not the good ones. This is a quote that has really made a lot of impact upon me because it's so visual. It's from William Bridges' book on transitions. He says the significance of transitions, it's like we launched out from a riverside dock to cross to a landing on the opposite shore, only to discover in midstream that the landing where we were headed was no longer there. And when we looked back at the other shore, we saw that the dock we left from had just broken loose and was headed downstream. I don't know about you, but I don't like being in the middle of the stream, thinking I know where I'm going, and the dock moves, and then I look back and I say, well, I can't go back where I came from either. It's a very disconcerting inner feeling. Contemplative word for it is liminal space, being in between worlds or in between two major transitions. And a lot of our lives are like this. And sometimes we have a little bit of say over it, and sometimes we're just going where the river takes us. So transitions of any nature involve a sense of loss. Something has to change or die in order that something new can grow. What's true in the cycle of nature recreating itself is also true in any component of growth. Acknowledging the pain of the loss is a major step in healing in order to grow into newer, deeper realms. When we gather as a faith community in our worship time and we're given time to speak to the person next to us and we say, hi, how are you? We have no idea what they may be bringing into that worship service with them, what they're dealing with either at home or at work or in finances or with health issues. They may be a full-time caregiver for somebody with a serious illness. And yet, when we ask them, how are you? They're supposed to answer with one word, aren't they? I'm fine. I'm fine, doing well, or I'm blessed. Life is a series of losses that sometimes we just need to acknowledge this is a death and I need to grieve for a little while. I don't know where this is going. And in order to do that, sometimes we need fellow travelers to walk with us in it. Ann Christensen is a professor here. Her husband died in a tragic plane crash right before COVID. He was an architect and they were going to see a site, to see a building, and the 6 people on board of this private plane crashed and he died suddenly, left her and 2 children. A very likable, wonderful man. But in reflecting upon it, when she wrote about having to deal with that grief in the middle of COVID, when everything was shut down and she basically was home alone except for Zoom, she came up with this: in life's hardest moments, 2 things are true, and usually more, but 2 often sharply distinct items show up: hope and dread, desire and aversion, loss and restoration, light and dark. Alongside love and anxiety, COVID times remind us that we need both permanence and change, and recognize that it's never one thing. In her article, she just talked about the discomfort of being pulled between these 2 polarities all the way, and the things that she just listed. And it's true, life is that way, and sometimes we need both permanence and change. But it's the change that tends to shatter us the most. And we say, God, where are you? How many times in the Psalms there's a word, how long, O Lord, how long? It's there a lot. People asking, where are you, God, in all this? And Joan Chittister says it this way in her wonderful book, Scarred by Struggle, Transformed by Hope. Struggle brings us to crossover points in life, after which we become new people. Sometimes worse, often better, but always different. I say any major event that occurs to us brings about change. People that go home from the hospital with a major health diagnosis, cancer or heart or whatever it is they're dealing with, often want to go home. And my view is they do get to go home many times, but they go home a different person. It may be the same house, but some things are changing within them because of the coming face to face with their own mortality and their own vulnerability. It's part of life. Now I want to introduce 2 incredible people. Judy Siburt. I don't know if there's any connection with the name of the Siburt Institute at Abilene Christian, but there may be some, maybe. Judy and I have been friends a long time. Her husband, Charles, and I were friends a long time. Both of her sons were interns here in Houston at Lifeline Chaplaincy many decades ago, and that's been an incredible thing. Judy is an educator, but her story that she went through with Charles, many of you knew Charles as head of the Doctor of Ministry program there. Many knew him as a minister, and many of us just knew him as an encouraging friend and a very brilliant man. But I want to have her story of some of the major changes that they went through as a couple and him as a minister. And then Dave Withington, I met here in Houston when he was doing clinical pastoral education at the Houston Methodist Hospital. And we wound up doing spiritual direction together. And he has this incredible personal narrative that I'll not give you too much hint on. But to wind up where he is now in the hospital where he is serving as a chaplain is nothing short of God intervention. So I'm going to stop the sharing. And I'm going to ask Judy to feel welcome and say anything about yourself and tell us about some of these transitional things that are still impacting your life.
I'll be happy to do that. I'm Judy Siburt, and I live in Abilene, Texas. And yes, I am connected somewhat to the Siburt Institute, thankfully. Virgil asked me to share some things about mine and Charlie's life together and some of the things we've endured and enjoyed together. I want to start the story. It's what I've learned about spiritual resilience through the years from Charles Siburt, my dear late husband, and my mother, Mabel Bailey, both who had their lives disrupted and who served and loved and who courageously suffered and died peaceful deaths, thankfully. I'll begin our story with, and when we left ACU as students, all educated and smart, we went to Fort Collins, Colorado. It was our first church. And Charlie was the preacher, and I was an elementary school I was an elementary counselor at the little school close by. It was there that Charlie noticed while he was trying to read and prepare that he couldn't see very well when he was reading. The eye specialist that we went to saw something on his retina, but he couldn't quite get a definitive diagnosis on it. It did seem to level out. In 1994, we were called to the Glenwood Church of Christ in Tyler. Charlie was 29 years old, and it was there the eye problem became much more evident. He had a series of 3 car crashes where he turned into an oncoming car. Fortunately, no one was injured, other than Charlie's pride, that is. It was at this point he realized that he looked both ways, but he was not able to see the oncoming car in the central of his vision. So after many eye invasive appointments down at the retinal specialist in Houston, he was finally diagnosed with a rare disease called Stargardt's disease. And it's a very rare form of macular degeneration that affects young adults and children often. It's progressive and it is incurable. And we were very scared. The reality was that Charlie would slowly go blind, and he wouldn't be able to see, to read, to study, to drive. So many unknowns, the dread, the fear, the helplessness, anger, sadness, and the deep sense of loss hit us really hard. But we learned a lot. We learned that naming the loss is not a cure, but it is a way of discovering the power to face it. Also, the goodness of friends, gifts of a great computer that read out loud, and the love of a family became the Spirit of God holding us up and guiding us. And it was just what we needed to keep going. We found a book that was written by a guy named Robert Kemper, and he was a minister with the exact same eye disease as Charles. The title of the book is An Elephant's Ballet. I'll talk more about that in a minute. But it's very much our story. I'm going to read a few excerpts from that book. 1997, Kemper says, I can read what I've written. Reading is important to me. Ministry, my church, and my home are loving and ordered. I'm a very happy man. 1971, a strange disease has struck my eyes. I have 2 blind centers. I'm not totally blind. I do have peripheral vision, but I may as well be. It's progressive, it's permanent, it's irrevocable. There is no future. 1972, I can see what I've written, but with great difficulty. I've made up my mind to do the best I can. I have help from some weird glasses and wonderful people. large church wants me to become their minister. Who ever heard of a blind minister? Thank you, God, but I'm not up to that. In 1974, he says, I can read, but with great difficulty. I lead our congregational church. I preach, I teach, and administer this large, vigorous church. There are some things I do not do well. There are some things I do not do at all. My wife, Margie, is learning to be the chauffeur, the repairman, and the bookkeeper of the household. It is not the way either of us wants it, but we are managing, and that will have to do. Thank you, God, for saving me. Kemper insisted on the title, The Elephant's Ballet. He said, this is my personal metaphor. The incongruity of Disney's Dumbo paired with Rudolph Nureyev, it may not be good ballet, but let's face it, it's amazing that he can do it at all. In one sense, it's lousy, even funny. And it's another sense, it's truly, truly amazing. That is how it is with wounded healers. That is how it is for all of us who respond to loss. That's how it is with people who are saved to grace, by grace. It's lousy and sometimes amazing. Faith is not magic. And we have learned that the vision loss that crippled us was really the loss of heart. Charlie loved the story of David and the quote, the Lord has rescued me from the paws of the lion and the bear, and he will rescue me from this giant. And faith is courage and believing deep down, I have what it takes to do what I need to do, not to fear the giants and creatively to face them. This is what courage looks like, is facing it even in face of deep loss. We did not realize that we would need to dig again deeper for more faith and courage at the time. In 2009, at the age of 62, Charlie was diagnosed with IgM multiple myeloma. It's a cancer of the blood and bone marrow. It is often treatable, and folks have lived as long as 15 plus years with the new treatments available. This was the hope we grabbed when we were given this diagnosis. The journey began with the hope of remission. The first bone marrow transplant gave us somewhat positive result, but the rare vicious cancer was resistant terribly. And our 3-year journey was filled with many doctors, nurses aides, pharmacists, and many, many bad lab reports. As Charlie said, we could really use some good news today. We didn't get that. We endured the horrible realities of cancer treatments, bone marrow transplants, long hospital stays that wear on even the calmest of spirits, strong chemotherapy, isolation where only those dressed like an astronaut can enter. I could only see him through the window a few hours a day and be with him. I could be with him a few hours a day. I could see him through a window the rest of the time. It was a dark time. It was a sad time. It was the deepest, hardest time for me, especially. But I think Charlie, he was a trooper. What can I say? But folks came and that saved us. We were there and we thought we couldn't be more alone. And here they can. And you know the saying, and many of you have heard this, you can pretend to care, but you can't pretend to show up. People showed up. And I mean, Christ's words, I was sick and you visited me, has new meaning to me. And we had loving presence of all the care from family and friends who kept showing up for us. For Charlie, a gregarious, fun-filled person, being alone for long periods was torture. It was truly torture. And I felt helpless and completely lost and overwhelmed. And after the last chance we had from a major cocktail of chemos, we both finally said, this is enough. We entered a lovely hospice room with accommodations for our families and friends. We shared loving conversations and tearful goodbyes. We were comforted by the presence and love of others quietly with us in the space. I was at his side, holding his hand when he breathed his last breath and with my face lying on his chest, I cried, I cannot do this. I cannot go on without this, without him. But the God of all comfort was there. I would be fine, even in my brokenness. While Charlie was in hospice, my 90-year-old mother was admitted to the same hospital for severe abdominal pain. It was a ruptured abdominal aortic aneurysm. Fortunately, the doctor on call, Dr. Carlson, who is a leading cardiovascular and thoracic surgeon, saw her. He saw her through a 7-hour surgery from which he told me she has a 10% chance of surviving this. At this time, Charlie is dying on floor 7. My mom may be dying on floor 3. You know, I was trying to be in 2 very sacred, special places, important places at the same time. Mother survived 7 more years. When she finally got to come home, I said, Mother, you know, you weren't supposed to live through that. And she said, yeah, I know, but I wanted to be sure you were not alone after sweet Charlie went on to heaven. She lived 7 more years. Little sweet thing. There is only one explanation for the way that I made it through that time, and it is because of God and all of the comfort that he brought to me. Pain and suffering, I've learned, are the price of being a human being and living on earth. Christ came to us to show us how to suffer and how to behave in the face of unimaginable loss. God is always on the side of the suffering wherever it is found. And I have learned that the indwelling Holy Spirit means we are never alone. Prayer is a way that we change ourselves, and it's not a way to control God. He is not Santa Claus or a magician. The closer we are to God, the more whole adult Christians we come, and God's answer to our prayers is always the same and the very best possible answer. You will receive power, and I will be with you. Power gives us hope and faith is the same as courage. Like David, we face Goliath with only a few stones. Courage to face and endure whatever comes to us. God and his Holy Spirit know suffering, and we are never alone. And we will be strong, brave, loving, humble, and courageous, just like Christ before Pilate. You cannot take my life. I give my life. It is only with the closeness of God and his Spirit within us can we move forward. And for that, I'm eternally grateful. And all this to say that grief is real. And it's not a sickness, and you don't get over it. You live on. I have learned that the great wisdom of grief is a treasure for your broken heart. It helps you to always remember so that the one who is gone will never be forgotten. It does not blunt the reality of the loss, but seeks to transform us. You will continue to live in love and to remember. That has been my experience. I want to close with a favorite quote from a hymn that I love. There is a place of comfort sweet near to the heart of God, a place where we our Savior meet near to the heart of God. O Jesus, blessed Redeemer, sent from the heart of God, hold us who wait before you near to the heart of God. Blessings. Thank you.
Wow, so powerful. I'm just disappointed you didn't sing the song for us.
I thought of it.
Thank you, Judy.
You're welcome.
You're an amazing friend and person, and you've just blessed all of us with the reality of the story. And I appreciate even ending with grief and saying we don't get over grief, we get through grief. There is a difference. There is a difference. Dave Wethington from Atlanta, I will let you pick up from there and tell any part of your story that you think fits in with this spiritual resilience thing. So welcome, Dave.
Sure. Well, thank you all for having me. As Virgil said, I'm Dave Wethington. I'm here in Atlanta, Georgia. This is, gosh, probably the third time I've been back to Atlanta, Georgia. God keeps calling me back here. I originally came to Atlanta, Georgia, to go to Georgia Tech to study chemical engineering, which I did. So I'm a graduate from Georgia Tech in chemical engineering. My wife, Allison, is from Texas, which is how I ended up with the Texas connection. She was all excited when I graduated Georgia Tech. I was a chemical engineer because she figured that I would end up in Texas because she's from Houston. And I said, Allison, you know what? I will never move to Houston, Texas, because it's too hot. Because I already live in hot Atlanta, I'm not moving to Houston. But after spending 5 years in Houston, there's nothing like the heat of Houston, Texas. So I'm glad to be back in hot Atlanta. The journey to get to Atlanta is not exactly how I thought it would go. But like I said, the Lord keeps calling me back to Atlanta. And so where I learned spiritual resilience is actually where I am sitting today. And so I am chaplain at Siburt Center. I found myself at Siburt Center as a patient back in 2012. And so for those of you who are familiar with Siburt Center is, or not familiar, Siburt Center is a facility for brain and spinal cord injury patients to learn how to rehabilitate and do things again, kind of like Tier Memorial Herman in Houston. Essentially, when I got to Siburt Center, I wasn't able to do anything. And so let me back up. I initially had surgery for a brain tumor about the size of a baseball. And so when they took most of the brain tumor out, my brain was like a bowl of spaghetti. And so I was living in Atlanta, Georgia at the time, working for a different engineering firm. And so I had the brain surgery at a hospital here in the Atlanta area. And so shortly after the brain surgery, they transferred me to Siburt Center to relearn how to walk, how to talk, how to function, how to think. And so what I wanted to highlight there, and I think this is helpful for those of you who are joining us that are in chaplaincy, considering chaplaincy, or in some sort of ministry. When I got to Siburt Center, as you hear, I felt like I had no purpose. I felt like I couldn't think. I couldn't add 1 + 1. And for an engineer to be able to add 1 + 1, that's a pretty important thing to do. More than just 1 + 1, but I wasn't able to do pretty much anything. Reading, speaking, hearing, all of that was a challenge. And so I remember one day I was sitting in one of our therapy gyms over a meal, and I felt like it was just pointless. And the hospital chaplain walked up to me, and he knew that faith was an important part of the journey for me. He knew I was a Christian. And he said, Dave, I just wanted to encourage you. I said, okay, Alan, I don't understand how you're going to encourage me. Everything has been taken from me. But, you know, I have faith, and I know that you may have something encouraging to share to me. He said, Dave, you're making my job so much easier. And my question was like, I don't understand. Tell me more. And he said, you're interacting with other patients here at Siburt Center in a way that I can't do. You're a patient going through the midst of everything that they're experiencing. He helped me to find purpose when I felt like I lost all purpose. And so I say all that to say, you never know what the words of a chaplain, a spiritual advisor, a spiritual director can make in terms of the trajectory of your life. But that was helpful, because essentially it gave me the confidence to participate in my therapy, to go to speech therapy, to go to physical therapy, to learn how to feed myself, how to get back to walking again. And so I felt like God had a purpose, God had a plan in the midst of my suffering. And as many of us will experience, and as Virgil highlighted in his story earlier, spiritual resilience. Where do we find spiritual resilience? How do we connect to the resources that we may already possess? If faith is an important part of the journey, a lot of times our faith journeys can help support us and sustain us through times like this. And I know that it did for me. So long story short, I began to walk and talk and function slowly but surely. Was discharged from Shepherd Center, but then I had to continue with radiation therapy for the brain tumor that they could not remove because it was on the brainstem. And so radiation therapy, even though I didn't have cancer, they had to treat the remainder of my tumor like it was cancer, because if they didn't take care of what was still there, it would just grow back and cause more problems. And so I had radiation therapy. And I wasn't sure what life was going to hold for me next. I wanted to go back to engineering, but I wasn't sure. While I was in the midst of radiation therapy, I should have started to feel sick, but instead it was my wife that started to feel sick, and wondering what was going on. We knew that any family planning wasn't happening during radiation therapy because that was not recommended, but we also had hoped to start a family. And so she went and got checked out by the doctor and found out that she was pregnant while I was in the midst of radiation therapy, and wondering how in the world the radiation was not allowing us to do any family planning. But she learned that she was probably pregnant, got pregnant the weekend before I started radiation. The reason I tell you that is because shortly after radiation therapy, about 6 months after radiation was over, our daughter Avery was born. I then became a stay-at-home dad 3 months after that, because I had already had enough trauma in my own life. So I became a stay-at-home dad for Avery, enrolled in seminary, part-time online, and moved to Houston, Texas to be a full-time seminarian. While I was in Houston, Texas, that's when I got involved in chaplaincy at Houston Methodist Hospital. So thinking of those words that chaplain told me years and years ago, he helped me to find purpose when I thought I had lost all purpose. I had no idea that chaplaincy would be my new purpose, but chaplaincy was that purpose. And to see how God has equipped me to be available for patients and family members in some of the difficult times of their lives has been an absolute blessing. And so fast forward to January 2020, I got contacted from the chaplain at Shepherd Center, and he wanted to let me know he would be moving on from his role at Shepherd Center, and wanted to know if I had any interest in coming back to Shepherd Center. And I said, wait a second, what's going on? Well, he knew that his position over the brain injury unit was going to be open. I would be a possible candidate because he knew I was in chaplaincy. So I interviewed, but then COVID happened. The whole world shut down. And as many of you know, life was turned upside down as we know it. But I was able to lean into some of that spiritual resilience that I learned of, finding hope and purpose when we weren't able to see a way forward. So I leaned on the fact that, okay, God, I don't understand how I'm going to get from Houston, Texas to Atlanta, Georgia in the midst of a global pandemic to work at Shepherd Center. But God, I've seen you make a way in the past. I trust and have confidence that you're going to make a way for me in the future. And so June 1st of 2020, God made a way when I didn't see a way. The world opened up enough that I was able to travel from Houston, Texas to Atlanta, Georgia. And I began as a chaplain at Shepherd Center over the brain injury unit, where I was once a patient. And so one thing I want to highlight in all of that is the Apostle Paul has a passage in one of the verses you've probably heard before. God says to the Apostle Paul, my grace is sufficient for you, for my power is made perfect in weakness. And so I still have some non-apparent disabilities. I'm not able to hear out of my right ear. I have double vision. I have some speech challenges throughout the day, but out of those weaknesses, I'm able to minister and connect with patients and family members and staff here at Shepherd Center in a way that I would have never thought possible. And to be able to impart some of that resilience that I learned while I was here at Shepherd Center into the daily goings on here in therapy and all of the challenges that our patients and family members are experiencing, it allows me to continue to find purpose when I felt like I had lost all purpose. God has a purpose in the plan, but it's hard for us to know in the midst of what we're experiencing. And so I just wanted to highlight that, we're going to face challenges in life. We're going to face difficulties in life. One of the best things we can do is reflect on how God has worked in our past and how we can be confident that God will work again in our future. but it goes back to that spiritual resilience. What have we learned about ourselves? What have we learned about God in past difficult situations that allows us to be able to persevere through the challenges that we face going forward? And so I say all this to say that I'm grateful to be available to our patients and families and staff. I'm grateful to be available to share a little bit of my story with you all. If it doesn't make any sense, I may have left some bits and pieces out because I know my story and you may have only heard this for the first time. And so if it doesn't make a whole lot of sense, just know that there are bits and pieces in there that may never make sense to me, may never make sense to you, but we can trust that God has a way to make sense out of things that don't make sense. So thank you all for your time, and I appreciate the.
Oh, thank you, Dave. I would like you to make mention of when you're even at Houston Methodist, one of the first places you were assigned was the brain injury floor.
Yes.
And you were going, let me think about that, right?
Yes. So interesting that you mentioned that. So yeah, when I was a resident at Houston Methodist Hospital and Texas Medical Center, my first clinical assignment was over the neurological floors. And so brain and spinal cord injury, I was front and center from a brand new brain and spinal cord injury where they're just learning the basics of basics. And so to see how God put me in a place to be able to provide that kind of support to patients and families in the initial stages to where God has led me today is amazing. And like I said earlier, I told Allison I would never move to Houston, Texas. I moved to Houston, Texas, but we came back to Atlanta.
Yeah. And not only Atlanta, but the very hospitals where you had been in recovery. So,
Yes.
So powerful. Thank you, Dave. Thank you.
Sure.
Would open it up. If anybody wants to ask a question, you can put it in the chat, or if you turn your mute off and want to speak, we have just a few minutes, and we've all learned a lot, I think, just from hearing the stories. Any comments or questions from anybody? All right. Okay. Yeah, Matthew.
I was going to ask Judy a question if she's still available.
Hello,
Judy,
Dave.
hi, my name's Matthew. I'm a staff chaplain at a hospital, a large hospital in the Detroit area in Michigan, and work as a palliative care chaplain, often with patients who are needing help deciding their goals of care and other issues, but many of whom make a decision to transition to hospice care in a variety of ways. And the opportunity to minister to families and to help them with next steps following the death of their loved ones is a regular part of the work. And I wondered if you were able to find resources to process your grief after Charlie's death, and if you would be willing to share what you found that was helpful in kind of processing and working on and doing some grief work, if you were able to do anything like that.
Well, yes, I did have some resources. I had opportunities to, the hospice program here is very, very good. And they followed up with me quite a bit to check on me. But one of the things that has helped me was a book, a little paperback book that a friend sent me, and it was called Healing the Heartbreak of Grief. And, the only thing about that title I don't like is you don't really, I guess it heals, but you don't get over it. But it was a great little book. And I happen to know the author. He was a former Baptist pastor here in Abilene at the large First Baptist Church. His name was James Fleming. And the book went through chapter by chapter, and it started with the complete devastation and the numbness of loss. He had studied in seminary, he had studied chaplaincy, he had been a Baptist minister for years. He had lost a 33-year-old precious son to leukemia. So I felt like he had a great credibility for me. And some of the things he said, and each chapter at the end of it were two things that you could do. One thing, today I can remember, and the other thing is today I can do. And that helped me a lot. And one of the chapters was, is there a way to have some sort of an altar or a tribute to the lost of the person? Not that you would go worship it, but you would have it there. And he was talking about, even though he was not Catholic, he had and his wife had been out somewhere, and he saw this crucifix. He brought that crucifix home because it reminded him of the suffering of his only son. And so things like that, little things like that. And then, and I was very religious with that book. I mean, it was kind of what helped me, writing down the things you miss the most, writing down. And one of the things that helped me, that I learned about grief, was that grief is a great teacher, and it's full of wisdom. And when you grasp the loss and all of that life brings you, you learn so much more about life, about people, and you learn that grief is a gift from God so that you don't forget what you want to always remember. Those are some of the things.
Good stuff. Thank you.
Thank you for that. Virgil, thank you for putting that book into the chat as well. Thank you.
Good grief would fit in well as.
Yeah, good grief is one of his main references in that book that I told you about.
Oh, interesting.
Yeah. It went way back to the old, classics.
Thank you both. Yeah, thank you.
Very good. I still use the chapter titles a lot in a grief support group, just to describe what can be part of the grief process. He doesn't use the word stage, he uses the word process.
Yep.
I appreciate you mentioning the importance of ritual and that creative use that the Baptist pastor mentioned about kind of having a place. I conduct twice a year for families in the hospital that experience pregnancy loss and miscarriage. Our hospital owns a plot in a local cemetery where the ashes of miscarried babies can be interred. And we have a remembrance ceremony, common cremation ceremony that I conduct. And that is such a powerful space. And a lot of the families tell me that having that space to come to sit with their grief and to remember, similar to what you were saying, is a real gift in a way that allows them to kind of focus that grief in a helpful way on memory making and meaning making out of that experience. So yeah, that the ritual itself could be so important.
Yeah, it is. I think it really is.
I'm a big believer, and particularly COVID has made it even more so, that we need grief rituals. When people say, I don't want a funeral, I've gotten a little older and bolder, and I say, it's not about you.
That's right.
The funeral is not about the deceased. It's about those that survived. It's like when people told me about Carol, aren't you glad she's not suffering anymore? Which sounds like a good statement. And yes, I would have to agree with that. However, I started saying, yes, the problem is I'm still here. So it doesn't address that side of it.
Yeah, that's right.
Funerals, memorial services, gathering, telling the stories.
Telling stories, yes. That's so good.
And the same is true with what chaplains do when people are in the middle of trying to figure out what to do and choices to make. So, Dave, I'm going to let you do the wrap up. Anything you want to add, and we'll consider.
Sure, I actually had something I wanted to add on to the grief thing. So as you were sharing all of that, we experience a lot of grief and loss here at Shepherd Center. Loss of functionality, loss of abilities to do things. I experienced a lot of grief and loss myself. One thing I will say that my wife has highlighted to me, since I've been here at Shepherd Center, she's noticed that there's been a change in me and how I'm not as emotional when I talk about my brain injury type stuff as I was before I got here. And so grief is a process, as we've all talked about, you know, whether it's the loss of a loved one, the loss of functionality. And so tapping into those resources, I think, you know, both personally and professionally allows us as a collective group to move forward. And so those were my final comments.
Good, good.
And it ties into the reference to wounded healers by Nowen. I mean, his whole premise is we are the best ministers when we don't have to have it all together, but when we can take what life has given us, even the hard stuff, and what are we learning from it? How can we journey with somebody rather than trying to fix them or straighten them out? I'm still learning that lesson, but I'm getting it. Well, you can see why I chose these two to be presenters. It's a blessing to have all of you join with us, and this is being recorded, so you can, through the Siburt Institute, will be able later to reconnect with it, or if you want to share it with somebody. And thank you for joining us this day. I'd like to close in prayer. God of all, Elohim Adonai, the one who has made us, who knows our every need before we even ask. We're grateful for this time together. We're grateful for your walking with us when life shatters us sometimes. And we've heard two extremely intense stories of that with Judy and with Dave. And to know that it's not the end of the story because of you, that you do walk with us. You give us resilience. You give us the people that help us just by showing up. May we all be that to each other and to those that we encounter this day. We ask in the name of Christ. Amen.
Thank you, Virgil.
Thank you. Thanks to all.